Hey guys, tonight we drift out to the edge of the Pacific, where moonlight folds itself across black lava rock and the hush of the sea is broken only by the shuffle of your own feet. The stones are still warm from the day, though the air is cooling, and you can smell that strange blend of salt and fresh water that will be the heart of this whole story. If you lean too far out on this uneven rock, you'll probably slip into brackish water, and let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. But that's why you're here listening and not out balancing in sandals at midnight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's fun to see just how far this sleepy tide drifts. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stones beneath your feet are not just rocks. They are the careful work of hands centuries old, carried from upland slopes and stacked in lines that curve like the arms of someone cupping water. You shift your weight, and it feels steady, though the sea sighs against it. Out there, waves roll lazily, not crashing. These walls are angled to tame them. If you look closer, small fish flicker at the edges, darting in and out where shadows break. This is no random tide pool. It's a designed pantry, built by people who understood tides the way you understand a smartphone battery level. Historians still argue whether the first ponds were experimental side projects or fully fleshed food systems the moment voyagers landed. But either way, what you're seeing is engineering so calm and so patient that it looks like nature itself built it. The mainstream historical fact here is that Hawaiian fishponds, or loko, are among the oldest examples of true aquaculture in the Pacific. They turn a stretch of coastline into a fish farm without neon signs or artificial filters. And the quirky tidbit? Some old chants describe walls being finished overnight by the mysterious menehune, a race of small people who show up only in legends, and maybe in the half-light after too much kava. As you stand there, you notice how brackish water makes a faint shimmer under the moon. Freshwater springs seep in from underground, meeting salt tides that pulse in and out. That's the secret. Not too salty, not too fresh, just confusing enough for algae and fish to thrive. If you've ever watered a houseplant and dumped in a suspicious mix of last night's tea, you know balance can be weird, but effective. A breeze pushes across your face, and you follow it toward the far curve of the wall. Somewhere inland, night birds call. You think about how many hands it would take to lift these boulders, how many backs bent, how many quiet instructions passed between generations. The pond is not a single event. It's a heartbeat that continues. Stone after stone, fish after fish. The moon climbs higher, silvering the surface, and you realize this isn't just about catching dinner. It's about slowing down to the tempo of tides, about recognizing that food doesn't need to arrive with plastic wrappers or Wi-Fi ordering apps. You stand in that silence, listening to both the sea and the stories hiding beneath it. And already you feel the edges of your own thoughts softening, like sand rinsed by waves. You shuffle along the curve of the wall, the basalt rough beneath your sandals, and pause where a darker ribbon ripples through the pond. It looks like someone spilled ink into the water, but it's only fresh water sliding in from underground springs. The pond breathes here, through cracks and seeps in the lava, and the ocean responds with its own pulse, rising, falling, mixing. You lean closer, watching how the ripples overlap, a soft quarrel between rivers and waves, and you realize this argument is exactly what makes the pond alive. Fresh water alone would be too gentle, too easy for plants to clog. Salt water alone would be too harsh, demanding gills tougher than most fry can manage. But together, the brackish water becomes a compromise, like a group project that, for once, actually works. Here, mullet find algae buffets, milkfish enjoy cozy nurseries, and smaller creatures dart through like they own the place. You breathe in the faint mineral smell, iron, sulfur, salt, and imagine a stew simmering invisibly below the surface. Historians still argue whether Hawaiians discovered the power of brackish water by accident. Maybe someone noticed fish clustering in natural tide pools, or whether it was the result of generations of deliberate trial and error. Either way, the fact is undeniable. The ponds thrived for centuries, feeding chiefs, commoners, and ceremonies alike. And the quirky tidbit? In some stories, guardians called mo Giant water lizards, sometimes helpful, sometimes cranky, were said to curl themselves along these springs. If you broke kapu and fished when you shouldn't, one of these guardians might flick its tail, sending a wave that tumbled you into the rocks. It's basically the mythological version of you break the rules, you get smacked. The stones here glisten with moisture, slick from constant spray. You run your hand over one, feeling how porous lava is, like a sponge hardened by fire. Through those hidden pores, fresh water seeps out, invisibly sustaining the delicate balance. You glance inland and picture rainfall months ago, threading through soil, carrying hints of banana leaves, ash, and earth, before finally arriving here. The pond is not just the sea's child, it's the land's too. The air is still, save for an occasional gust that ruffles the water into silver feathers. You notice little crabs skitter sideways across the stones, pretending they have important errands. Maybe they do. Tiny janitors of the ecosystem, cleaning algae while dodging your shadow. They look like medieval knights in armor, only much less dignified when they trip over a pebble. You walk on, the wall narrowing, curving outward like a welcoming arm. The mingling waters hum beneath you, a soundless vibration. And you realize this was the genius of the design, not conquering nature, but coaxing it into cooperation. No pumps, no pipes, no diesel engines, just springs, tides, and patience. It's a system so efficient, it might put your fridge to shame. You lean down again, peering into the shimmer where fresh meets salt. Fish flicker past in silhouettes, their scales catching moonlight like scattered coins. They don't know about chiefs or ceremonies or the long debates of scholars. They just know the water here feels right, neither too sharp nor too soft, like a perfect pillow after a long day. The longer you stand, the more you feel the pond exhale. The stones warm your feet, the water sighs against the wall. It's as if the whole structure is alive, quietly maintaining balance without demanding thanks. You stretch your arms, yawn against the hush of the sea, and let the rhythm of mingling tides sink deeper into your own breathing. You keep tracing the wall until the sound of waves softens, and you let your eyes wander past the horizon. You picture another night, many centuries earlier, when double-hulled canoes cut across this same moonlit water. The sails were mats of woven lohala leaves, taut with the trade wind, creaking softly like an old hammock. You see the voyagers crouched near the bow, staring at stars you can barely name, and you imagine how exhausting it must have been to steer by starlight and seabirds rather than by a glowing GPS dot on your phone. The mainstream historical fact is that Polynesians were master navigators, finding their way across thousands of miles using nothing but wind, swell patterns, star maps memorized in chance, and a level of patience that would put modern commuters to shame. When they arrived in Hawaii, they faced coastlines wild with reefs and cliffs, but also dotted with coves, river mouths, and springs. Choosing where to settle wasn't just about planting taro or building houses. It was about finding the perfect partnership between ocean and land. You watch as one navigator squints at seabirds wheeling overhead. They fly out at dawn and return at dusk, which basically makes them feathered GPS satellites. A cluster of them veers toward a green smear on the horizon. That's the signal. Land. You follow his gaze, your heart quickening as you imagine that first glimpse of these volcanic peaks rising from the sea like the backs of sleeping giants. Historians still argue whether fish ponds were part of the voyagers' original toolkit or a Hawaiian innovation born after settlement. Some believe smaller aquaculture methods existed in other islands, while others argue the scale and sophistication here was unique, crafted by centuries of adapting to Hawaii's sheer abundance of springs and shorelines. Either way, the voyagers had found their stage, and soon the coastlines would hum with quiet stonework. And here's your quirky tidbit. Oral traditions sometimes describe voyagers bringing pigs, dogs, chickens, and plants, but one story claims that a voyager also smuggled aboard a pet lizard who then became one of the guardian mo'o. It's probably the most awkward emotional support animal scenario ever imagined. Try explaining to your canoe mates why you're feeding a reptile instead of sharing the last coconut. As you picture them dragging canoes onto sand, you notice how carefully they scan the shoreline. They aren't just looking for shelter, they're looking for places where fresh water trickles into the sea. Springs, river mouths, and tidal flats. All the ingredients for what will later become fish ponds. It's like shopping for a house, except instead of checking for closet space, you're checking if mullet can spawn nearby. The voyagers test the water with gourds, tasting the subtle shift between salt and fresh. They press palms against wet sand, feeling the cool seep of underground water. When they find the right place, they know. Here is a future. Not just for a village, but for ponds, walls, gates, and the fish that will feed both chiefs and children. You can almost hear the laughter of those first families setting up camp, the crackle of their fire against the dark, the smell of roasted breadfruit wafting through the night. They don't yet have walls in the sea, but already the blueprint is written in their minds. The horizon in your own time gleams faintly. Stars scatter overhead, the Milky Way streaking like a spilled bag of sugar. The waves lap the stones beside you, patient and eternal. And you realize the voyager's greatest gift wasn't just survival across endless seas. It was seeing potential in these mingling waters and imagining a pantry that would last for generations. The wall curves you toward a quieter corner where the water lies smooth as glass. You crouch here, tracing words with your fingertip on the damp stone, as if labeling things will make them more yours. And indeed, names matter, so much so that Hawaiians classified fish ponds with a vocabulary as precise as your favorite streaming service categories, except without the endless debate over what counts as romantic comedy. The mainstream historical fact. There are several distinct types of loko ia, each with its own purpose and personality. The most famous is the loko kuapa, the seawall pond you've been walking along, curving out into the ocean like a great arm. But inland, there are loko wai, freshwater ponds fed by streams or springs. There are loko puone, coastal ponds scooped from sandy barriers, like someone drew a lazy line in the beach with a stick and water agreed to stay put. And then there are loko auwai, ponds fed directly by irrigation ditches, blending farming with fish keeping in a way modern city planners would put in a glossy brochure and call integrated resource management. Historians still argue whether these classifications were strictly formal or more flexible in daily use. Did everyone follow the same vocabulary? Or did names shift by island, family, or even by which elder was in a particularly bossy mood that day? The debates echo in university papers, but out here under the moon, the water doesn't seem to care. And for the quirky tidbit, some chants suggest ponds themselves had nicknames, pet names given by their builders, often tied to local legends or even gentle insults like the lazy pond, if the fish were underperforming. Imagine your pantry giving you side-eye for only stocking it with instant ramen. You lean back, staring at the moon's reflection, and imagine how each name was a kind of spell. Say loko kuapa, and you conjure visions of stone walls stretching into tide. Say loko wai, and you hear the trickle of a mountain stream feeding a quiet pool. Each word carried not only description, but responsibility. Knowing the type meant knowing how to tend it, when to harvest, and what dangers to expect. The wall beneath you hums with this taxonomy, even if silently. You run your hand along its curve, thinking of how carefully Hawaiians matched design to environment. No single model dominated. Instead, the vocabulary mirrored the diversity of the islands themselves. A pond was not just a pond, it was an agreement between geography, culture, and sustenance. A night breeze pushes across your shoulders. You watch as ripples distort the moon's face into a sleepy grin. For a moment, you imagine the fish beneath you whispering in categories too, sorting their algae snacks into playlists. Crunchy, slimy, downright delicious. Maybe they even gossip. Don't swim into that gate, it's a trap. You exhale, resting your chin on your hands. The pond feels vast, but naming its parts makes it approachable, like learning the corners of a new room. And as you let the words echo, kuapa, wai, puona, auwai, you realize they are less like labels and more like lullabies, sung by water itself. You move farther along the wall until the stones suddenly jut outward, thicker, sturdier, like the buttress of some ancient cathedral. Here, you realize, is where the work of building truly mattered. You crouch, running your fingers along the basalt, and you can almost hear the thump of rocks being carried, one after another, down from the uplands. The mainstream historical fact, the kuapa, the great seawall, was usually curved or arcing rather than straight. This wasn't laziness or sloppy design, it was engineering genius. The curve absorbed wave energy, spreading the force rather than letting it slam head-on. Some walls stretched for half a mile, built of thousands of stones stacked without mortar, relying only on balance and weight. You think about that the next time your IKEA bookshelf leans precariously, even after an afternoon of assembly. Historians still argue whether massive community labor projects to build Kuapa were strictly commanded by chiefs, or whether they had more of a festival atmosphere with food, chants, and a sort of block party vibe. Maybe both. The truth probably lies somewhere between mandatory hard labor and yay free snacks. As for a quirky tidbit, one legend tells of Menehune builders who supposedly finished entire stretches of wall in a single night, working in silence, passing rocks hand to hand. The catch? If they were interrupted or mocked, they'd vanish, leaving half a wall and a lot of confused humans the next morning. Which, to be fair, sounds exactly like the group project partner who disappears once deadlines get real. You close your eyes and picture it. A chain of villagers stretching from mountain to shore, each lifting and handing down a stone, the rhythm as steady as a drumbeat. Kids scamper around delivering water gourds. Elders supervise, muttering reminders. Somewhere, a conch shell blows, signaling the day's progress. The rocks, once jagged and awkward, slowly become a smooth arc curving into the sea, like a massive arm wrapping around the future. You run your palm across the stones again, noticing the different textures. Rough lava, smooth river rock. The builders used whatever worked best, balancing heavy boulders at the base, layering smaller ones above. The gaps weren't mistakes, they let water flow in and out, keeping the pond refreshed and alive. It's the kind of low-tech brilliance that would impress any modern engineer, or at least make them mutter, "Okay, that's annoyingly clever." The night air cools, and you notice the faint scent of seaweed clinging to the rocks. Somewhere nearby, waves hiss softly against the outer wall, but here inside, the water is calm, glassy, protected. You realize how much work went into creating this calm. Every stone hauled, every back bent, every chant sung to give strength. The curve of the wall extends into the dark, disappearing into horizon and imagination alike. It isn't just a barrier, it's a promise. One stone at a time, patience hardened into permanence. You straighten, stretch your spine, and feel your own shoulders heavy, as if you've just carried a few boulders yourself. The pond waits silently, the stones humming with history, and you step forward, cradled in the architecture of persistence. You shuffle to a narrow break in the wall where wooden slats once framed the sea. The stones narrow into a throat, and you realize you're standing at the makaha, the sluice gate, the beating heart of the pond. Without it, this calm enclosure would just be a fancy swimming pool with no snacks inside. The mainstream historical fact. Makaha were wooden gates fitted with vertical slats, carefully spaced so that the tide could flow in and out, but fish movements were controlled. Tiny fry could slip through the gaps on incoming tides, entering the pond as uninvited but welcome guests. But as they grew, their bodies became too large to escape. The pond wasn't a prison exactly. It was more like a long-term Airbnb with no checkout policy. Historians still argue whether the gates were standardized in construction or highly customized depending on local tides. Some suggest a complex knowledge of carpentry was passed down from generation to generation, while others wonder if each makaha was more of a best-guess design tuned over time by patient observation. Either way, the gates worked, breathing with the ocean like a set of wooden lungs. And the quirky tidbit? In some stories, fishermen would give their gates little nicknames, as if they were mischievous pets. A stubborn one that clogged often might be called the sleepy gate, while one that never leaked could be praised with affectionate chants. Imagine talking to your kitchen door every morning. "Good job not squeaking today, buddy." You kneel closer, imagining the sound. At high tide, water surges in, foamy fingers squeezing past the slats, carrying larvae and fry. At low tide, the pond exhales and the gate resists, holding back the grown fish. It's a simple trick, but it turned tidal rhythms into food security. You run your hand over a nearby stone, feeling the grooves worn from centuries of adjusting, repairing, maintaining. The gate isn't just about fish, it's about timing. Fishermen had to know the tides intimately, had to watch moon phases, had to slip nets in and out without upsetting the balance. Too greedy, and the pond empties. Too patient, and you end up feeding fish that are practically your roommates. You picture a family arguing over whether a mullet is big enough for dinner, the way modern families argue over whether a pizza slice is too small to count as a full serving. The night presses quiet around you. You can hear the faint slap of a fish in the darkness, startled by your presence. In your mind, the makaha creaks, opens, sighs. It's not an invention of force, it's persuasion. The gate doesn't fight the sea, it leans into its rhythm, borrowing strength from the tide itself. You glance at the horizon, where moonlight smears across the water. Somewhere out there, the tide is shifting again. Invisible, but inevitable. The gate will open, the pond will inhale, and tiny fish will slip through like whispers. You breathe in, long and slow, letting your lungs mimic the makaha's calm tide. For a moment, you feel the pond breathing with you. Inhale, exhale, all night long. You pause where the water deepens to tea-dark green, and shapes drift in and out of the moon's path like thoughts you haven't decided to keep. There, silver flashes, quick as a blink. You settle into the rhythm of watching, and the pond's regulars start to reveal themselves like neighbors on their evening walk, comfortable enough to ignore you unless you make loud human decisions. The mainstream historical fact is simple and satisfying. Hawaiian fishponds commonly raised ama, mullet, awa, milkfish, and a hole, Hawaiian flagtail. Those names carry flavors, you can almost taste them, soft vowel sounds that move like water. Each species brings a different patience, a different way of turning tide into supper, and you feel yourself learning the roster like a lullaby. First, the mullet, the ever-browsers, silver and skeptical. Ama glide with a kind of resigned dignity, as if they've been through this tide thing before and would prefer fewer surprises. They tilt their mouths downward and pucker at the stones, grazing algae the way you might nibble at a bag of chips while insisting you're not really hungry. When they're small, people call them pua, seedlings, because they slip in through the makaha like tiny ideas, harmless and hopeful. When they grow enormous, they earn a new title, anai, and the entire pond seems to step back respectfully like, yes sir, right this way to the VIP section. You watch one flick its tail, a thin bolt of mercury, and it's suddenly 3 paces away with no explanation, which is also how your best socks vanish in the laundry. Then, the milkfish, awa, sleeker, almost dreamy, scales reflecting moonlight like polished spoons. They cruise midwater, not in a hurry, doing the aquatic equivalent of window shopping. Awe love calm, warm ponds fed by steady seepage. If the water were a bed, they'd insist on a soft mattress topper and maybe a lavender pillow spray. Here's your quirky tidbit. The word awa also names the kava drink, the relaxing root brew, so it's tempting to joke that milkfish are sleepy because they're named after bedtime tea. Scholars will tell you the shared syllables aren't culinary destiny, but your brain can't resist the pun, and neither can mine. Last comes the hole, the flagtail, more dart than fish when it's young. In the moonlight, their bodies flash white like torn strips of paper. They gather near the makaha and along the sheltered edges, jittery and social. Watch long enough and you'll see one suddenly nip, another flit away, a third hover like a punctuation mark deciding between a comma and a period. They're skittish but curious, the small kids at a party who orbit the snack table and never actually make eye contact. Historians still argue whether keepers deliberately stocked certain species, carrying live fish in gourds or baskets to seed ponds, or mostly relied on the tide to invite in whatever fry the sea offered each season. Either way, the behavior you're seeing is no accident. It's a choreography refined by gate width, wall curve, and years of patient observation. The pond doesn't yell, it hums the fish into place. You crouch and notice soft mats of limu algae feathering the stones. If you were a mullet, this would be an all-you-can-nibble buffet, open 24 tides a day, no reservation needed. The fish's mouths rasp gently over the rock, and if you lean very close, you almost hear a faint squeak, like someone erasing a chalkboard with a sponge. It's weirdly adorable, in the way that spreadsheets are adorable when the formulas actually balance. A bigger body moves under the surface, and for a heartbeat you think shark, like every tourist who has watched 2 documentaries and a thriller, but it's just a hefty ama making rounds, the pond's veteran security guard. It pivots, then rockets forward and thwack, jumps in a clean arc. That's a mullet habit, leaving the water like a punctuation mark to a sentence only it understands. Some say they jump to oxygenate gills, others to escape parasites, and a few aunties swear it's because they're nosy and want to check the weather. Whatever the reason, it's a reliable way to make you gasp quietly and reconsider your life choices. You think of the makaha again, the wooden lungs you knelt by, and realize how each species negotiates that doorway differently. AWA and a hole come in as optimistic fry on high tides, then hang around for the amenities. Calm water, food growing on every stone, lower predation than out in the open sea. Mullet, ever the pragmatists, sample the edges, then commit. Over months, bodies thicken, scales shine, and harvest days approach. Never rushed, never wasteful. A small wavelet nudges your sandal. You ease back a step and feel the wall settle under you like a friendly bench. Above, a thin cloud drifts across the moon, dimming the surface to slate. In the softened light, the fish's movements seem slower, more deliberate, and you settle into their timing. You can wait here forever if the tide asks it. The joke's on you. You came for history and found a meditation app with fins. There's a house on the hill rhythm to this place. Humans building structure, fish adding motion, tide keeping time. You imagine keepers doing their rounds at dawn, circling quietly, eyes trained for subtle changes. A new patch of limu here, a cloudier swath there, a fish that swims a little off. The knowledge is built on repetition more than revelation, on seeing the pond not as scenery but as a conversation you're lucky to overhear. Another quirky note drifts by. Some families were said to sing short lines as they fed scraps to the shallows, fragments of melody that became fish-calling songs. Whether the fish understood or the humans did is immaterial. Either way, dinner showed up. You hum something tuneless just to test the theory. A mullet ignores you with professional poise. Fair. You wouldn't come to the table if the waiter hummed at you either. The smell here is clean and vegetal, like cucumbers smashed into sea spray. Your fingertips pick up a faint slickness from the stones, a reminder that algae is farming sunlight into something chewable. The elegance of it lands again. The pond is a solar-powered protein factory disguised as a beach. No chargers, no notifications unless you count the mullet jumps as push alerts. You do, and they're always allow. None. In the distance, a night heron barks, awkward, dinosaurish, like a door hinge that learned to complain. The fish dive and resurface, unconcerned. The bird will hunt the margins. The pond will give and take in its patient ratio. Everything here seems to have agreed on a set of manners. Keep moving, keep grazing, keep the peace. You remember the Menahune stories and imagine a tiny foreman standing on your sandal, arms crossed, inspecting tonight's fish attendance. Mullet, present. Milkfish, present. Flagtail, distracted but present. You're tempted to whisper a roll call yourself, as if the fish might line up alphabetically. They don't, which is rude, but you forgive them. They don't know their letters. Another silver flare, then calm. Your breathing falls into lockstep with the water's borrow and return, and you feel the mildly heroic patience that this place has required for centuries. The keepers learned each species' appetite, comfort zones, and seasons. They learned when to wait and when to lift nets, when to shift a stone, and when to leave the wall alone. If there's a curriculum, it's written in ripples. If there's a final exam, it's a full pantry and a quiet conscience. The moon slides free of the cloud, and the pond brightens again. You tuck your hands into your pockets, an automatic human gesture of standing still, and let your gaze soften. The fish are still there, of course they are. But now they are less objects and more motion, a flicker that belongs to the water as much as to themselves. You accept the lesson the way the pond accepts the tide, without hurry and with a small, sleepy smile. The stones beneath your feet warm you still, but now your eyes wander inward, into the water where the true garden lies. You lean down, almost nose to surface, and notice the film of green feathering along submerged rocks. Not slime, not scum. This is limu, algae, the silent crop that turns light and minerals into a buffet line for fish. The mainstream historical fact. Hawaiian fishponds weren't simply about trapping fish. They were designed as underwater farms, where algae, plankton, and detritus built up into a food chain that mullet, milkfish, and flagtails could graze upon endlessly. The pond wasn't just a pantry, it was also a kitchen, cooking sunlight into sustenance. You glance at the stones and see how their pores hold just enough silt to anchor filaments of limu, each one waving in the tide like lazy dancers in a slow-motion music video. Historians still argue whether pond keepers deliberately seeded limu species, encouraging growth with scraps, or whether they mostly relied on nature's accidents. Some swear there were techniques. fertilizer made from decomposed plants, mud churned just so, ash sprinkled after cooking fires. Others suspect it was less intervention and more patience. Leave a rock alone and soon it'll bloom green enough to make fish swoon. The debate remains while the fish don't bother waiting for citations. And the quirky tidbit? There are stories of keepers throwing in bundles of cooked taro leaves or breadfruit peelings, not as waste, but as appetizers. Over time, the pond became a compost bin with benefits. Fish nibbling, algae thriving, nutrient cycling. If your modern compost tumbler fed you sushi rolls at the end, you'd brag too. You dip your fingers into the water. It feels warmer than the ocean outside, a solar-heated soup rich with suspended particles. Fish slide through it with ease, their mouths opening and closing, filtering the microscopic feast. You notice how mullet, with their downward mouths, spend their lives grazing like cows of the sea, turning algae into sleek, edible muscle. Their waste feeds plankton, which feeds more fish, which keeps the cycle humming. The pond is a circular economy centuries before TED Talks coined the term. Nearby, the mud looks ordinary, just a dark carpet under shallow water. But if you scoop some, you'd find it rich with detritus, tiny crustaceans, decomposed plant bits, invisible nutrients. It's like the ultimate smoothie, pre-blended by tides. The fish stir it as they root, releasing clouds that drift like smoke. You lean closer, the surface broken by rings of feeding. For a moment, you imagine you're hovering above an alien meadow, where grass grows liquid and animals drift through like thoughts. You picture keepers standing barefoot in shallows, watching limu growth the way gardeners watch tomato vines. Too much bloom and the water might choke. Too little, and the fish go hungry. Balance was everything, found through daily walks, the tilt of a hand into the pond, the taste of water on the tongue. A keeper might spit it out with a nod. Just salty enough, just alive enough. You wince, thinking about your own habit of taste-testing pasta water, and realize maybe it isn't so different. A night breeze stirs the pond's skin, bending moonlight into long ripples. You watch fish slide past, their bellies brushing algae as if grocery shopping aisle by aisle. You chuckle softly, imagining them debating brands. This rock has the organic stuff. That one tastes like fertilizer runoff. Even in jest, you sense the truth. Fish learn preferences, and keepers learn to notice them. Somewhere inland, you catch the faint smoke of a cooking fire. The scent reminds you of taro, bananas, breadfruit, all the crops that tied pond and field together. When harvests inland failed, fish ponds offered protein. When fish harvests lagged, fields filled bellies. It was less about surplus and more about a steady rhythm, a balance between mud and stone, rain and tide. The water below thickens with shadow as a cloud sails over the moon. In the dim light, algae becomes ghostly hair on stone, swaying without hurry. You inhale, long and slow, and the pond inhales with you, mud, limu, detritus, fish, all recycling, all alive. You feel smaller than the cycle, yet comforted, folded into the quiet machinery of brackish life. The pond grows quieter as the night deepens, and you picture not just fish and algae, but people, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, working, watching, and regulating this living larder. You picture hands passing stones, feet pressing mud, and then, beyond that, rules. Those invisible walls that kept the system balanced when muscle alone couldn't. The mainstream historical fact: Hawaiian society enforced kapu, a system of sacred laws and taboos, in everyday life, including fish ponds. These rules dictated who could fish, when nets could be cast, and which harvests were reserved for chiefs. Some ponds were chiefly property, feeding alii and their households, while others served communities more broadly. Breaking kapu wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was believed to disrupt balance, anger gods, and invite scarcity. If you've ever eaten someone's clearly labeled leftovers from the office fridge, you already know how socially dangerous that can be. Historians still argue whether kapu was more about strict spiritual enforcement or practical resource management disguised in divine wrapping paper. Was it about cosmic order, or simply about making sure no one emptied the pantry too soon? Probably both, though few dared to test the line too boldly. Your quirky tidbit. Some fish ponds had guardians assigned, individuals whose job was to literally watch the gates, count fish, and ensure rules were obeyed. Picture an ancient lifeguard, but with fewer whistles and more side-eye. Oral accounts even describe night patrols, where keepers carried torches to scare off poachers. Imagine trying to sneak fish in the moonlight, only to be caught by a glowing figure muttering about kapu. Not exactly Ocean's 11. You stand and imagine yourself one of those watchers. The wall is solid under you, the tide breathing against the makaha, and your eyes sweep the dark water. You're listening for splashes that don't fit the rhythm, watching for silhouettes that move too quickly. In your mind, a neighbor's nephew tiptoes near, basket in hand, and you cough loudly, just once, enough to remind him the pond has eyes. The rules weren't all about restriction. They also structured sharing. Fish harvests were often distributed. Portions to the chiefs, portions to the priests, portions to families. Ceremonies marked the giving, tying the pond's bounty to the rhythm of society. The stones held not just fish, but fairness. At least fairness as defined by hierarchy. Still, there were practical jokes woven in. You imagine a keeper teasing a young fisherman for dropping a mullet, or elders muttering about someone too impatient to wait for spawning season. The humor didn't break the rules. It reinforced them. A gentle reminder that patience and respect were part of survival. You trail your hand along the damp stone, thinking of the countless palms that did the same, enforcing rules not just with threats, but with habits, stories, songs. The pond didn't thrive because people grabbed all they could. It thrived because people agreed not to. The silence around you feels thicker with that realization, like the air itself remembers whispered promises. Moonlight glitters across the water, broken by a fish leaping suddenly, then vanishing with a splash. You smile, imagining the old keepers reading that leap as a sign, or maybe just a fish laughing at your attempts to understand. Either way, you sit back down, rules and ripples both settling into you like pebbles into sand. The pond exhales slowly, and you notice how the surface shifts, not from wind, but from something subtler. The moon tugs at the water, and suddenly you're aware of calendars written not in paper, but in silver light. Here, the pond's rhythm isn't daily or weekly, but lunar. The fish know it, the tides obey it, and the keepers centuries ago lived by it. The mainstream historical fact. Hawaiians used a lunar calendar of about 30 nights, each with its own name and personality, to guide activities like planting, fishing, and ritual. For fish ponds, certain nights were considered favorable for casting nets, while others were best for restraint, letting stocks replenish. Oli nights, for instance, were often deemed unproductive, a time to hold back rather than push your luck. The stars above were not just pretty. They were reminders of when to work, when to rest, and when to whisper thanks. Historians still argue whether the lunar rules were standardized across all islands or varied by local tradition. Did everyone agree that the third Hilo night was prime for mullet, or did different keepers adapt their own lore? The debate continues, but either way, the pond itself kept the truest record. Abundance or absence, growth or hunger. And here's your quirky tidbit. Oral accounts describe people literally talking to the moon, asking it to bless their nets or calm the tides. One chant reportedly teased the moon about being lazy, urging it to show up brighter so the fishermen could see what they were doing. Imagine standing at the shore, wagging a finger at a celestial body. Don't phone it in tonight. We've got work to do. You crouch at the wall and gaze at the reflection. The moon floats there, fractured by ripples, looking like a coin tossed into a fountain. You almost whisper a wish. The fish move below, silvering just enough to suggest they're listening too. On certain nights, they would gather closer to the gates, ready to be coaxed by nets or baskets. On other nights, they'd scatter, hiding in the shadows as if they too read the calendar. You picture a family arriving quietly on a moon-bright night. Nets coiled, torches dimmed, they move like shadows, careful not to waste the chance. A conch shell might sound softly across the water, more prayer than announcement. The makaha creaks, water surges, and nets sweep in arcs. Each splash is measured, not frantic. Each fish taken is chosen. The pond will breathe again tomorrow, so the people don't rush today. You can almost hear the laughter after. Children splashing, elders shaking heads at slippery escapes, someone joking that the fish had memorized the lunar cycle better than the humans. Maybe they were right. Maybe the fish knew to stay quiet on old nights and leap on the nights of fullness, mocking nets with acrobatics. The breeze smells of salt and something faintly sweet. Plumeria carried from inland. You exhale and watch how the moon's reflection trembles as your breath stirs the surface. The pond has waded through thousands of lunar cycles. It doesn't need certainty, only repetition, and you feel yourself softening to that pace, your thoughts falling into orbit with the tides. The stones under your hand feel colder now, slick with spray, and the night deepens into a hush that seems older than memory. You close your eyes, and in that dark, the pond begins to murmur, not with splashes of mullet, but with stories. The walls, after all, are not mute. They've absorbed chants, whispers, and legends as surely as they absorb waves. The mainstream historical fact: Hawaiian fishponds are bound to mythology, their walls attributed not only to human hands, but also to supernatural builders. Tales of menehune, small industrious nightworkers, claim that if a chief ordered a pond built, the menehune might complete it in a single night, stone by stone, provided they were not interrupted. These stories blur the line between history and myth, reinforcing the awe such structures inspired. Historians still argue whether the menehune legends represent an actual earlier people, displaced by later arrivals, or whether they are entirely mythical, cultural shorthand for built so long ago we've forgotten who started it. The debate lingers in books and lectures, while the ponds themselves sit unbothered, their stones humming with mystery. Your quirky tidbit. One legend speaks of mo'o, giant water lizards, half creature, half spirit, who made ponds their homes. They guarded fish and punished rule breakers, sometimes with storms, sometimes with sudden drownings. Families would leave offerings at certain rocks, not because they feared the neighbor's gossip, but because they feared a reptilian deity with a serious temper. Imagine trying to explain to your boss you missed work because a mythological lizard got offended. You lean on the wall, listening harder. Maybe the splash you just heard wasn't a mullet, but a mo'o shifting under the water. Maybe the whisper of the tide against the makaha is a menehune giggling. Rationality tells you no, but the night has a way of loosening rationality's grip. The stones themselves hold stories. Each gap, each worn surface might be linked to a tale. A rock dropped by a careless worker. A section repaired after a storm that villagers explained away as the wrath of a mo'o. Legends wove themselves into maintenance, so that even when someone replaced a gate slat, they might mutter a chant, just in case unseen ears were listening. You picture families gathered at the pond's edge, elders recounting tales to children, pointing at ripples and declaring them signs. A fish leaps, and the elder says, "That's the menehune checking our work." The children laugh nervously, then glance into the dark water with more respect. Myth was not decoration, it was instruction, a way of embedding reverence into stone and tide. Another splash jolts you, sharper this time. Your heart thuds, then settles as you realize it's just a mullet showing off again. But for a second, you could swear you saw a shadow curl beneath the surface, long and serpentine. You chuckle at yourself, shaking your head, but keep one wary eye on the pond. The legends may not be provable, but they are palpable. They fold into the night air, thick as the smell of salt, reminding you that history here isn't just dates and facts, it's also whispers and warnings. You stretch your legs, sigh into the silence, and let the mingling of myth and memory settle around you like a blanket. The pond feels more familiar now, less a mystery and more a neighborhood. You shift along the wall and glance inland, where torchlight might once have flickered from houses, casting warm reflections across the water. For all the talk of walls, gates, and myths, the fish pond was also an extension of everyday life, woven into the rhythm of chores and laughter. The mainstream historical fact: fish ponds were not isolated fortresses. They were part of the Ahupua'a system, a wedge of land stretching from mountain to sea, where resources were managed in harmony. The pond was the oceanside pantry, complementing upland taro fields, sweet potato patches, and fruit trees. Families worked across these zones, each contribution supporting the whole. In other words, dinner was a team sport. Historians still argue how much daily access commoners had to ponds. Some accounts suggest chiefly control, others hint at shared responsibilities, with families assigned tasks like clearing gates or collecting laimu. The ambiguity lingers, but what's clear is that the ponds weren't silent monuments. They were humming with footsteps, tools, and gossip. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some early foreign visitors wrote that Hawaiians trained dogs to help herd fish toward shallows, splashing in the water to corral them. Whether this was an actual practice or just a traveler's wild exaggeration is debated, but you can't help picturing a very wet, very confused dog barking at mullet, who are equally confused. You lean back against the wall and imagine the scene centuries ago. Children splashing at the edges, daring each other to grab small a-hole with bare hands. Elders sitting nearby, weaving nets or repairing gourds. Women gathering limu, their laughter carried over the water. Men checking the gates, adjusting stones with the quiet authority of routine. The pond was not only a larder, it was a playground, a workplace, and sometimes even a classroom. Chores slid into rituals of daily life. A boy sent to scare birds away might end up sprawled in the sun, watching clouds until a scolding auntie reminded him that the fish weren't going to guard themselves. Someone stirring a cooking fire would glance toward the pond, gauging whether the tide looked right for a quick harvest. Even gossip circled back to the pond, who had bragged about catching a fat mullet, who had fumbled and let one slip back through the gate. The stones you sit on have heard centuries of this. Giggles, scoldings, songs half sung while patching nets. You feel a strange comfort in that ordinariness. History isn't just about great chiefs and wars. It's also about small domestic moments, repeated so often that they stitched permanence into the place. The night around you carries its own echoes. A breeze rattles the brush inland, like the clatter of kids chasing each other. The pond's surface shimmers faintly, as if reflecting torchlight long extinguished. You sigh, imagining your bare feet muddied, your hands salty from pulling net cord, your shoulders warmed by laughter as much as by sun. Everyday life is always the part that slips away first, lost in the grand retellings. But here, leaning on stones slick with memory, you can almost pull it back. The simple rhythm of chores, stories, and tired bodies resting at day's end, pond and people both settling into sleep. You're still following the curve of the wall when the quiet horizon picks up a new geometry, straight lines where nature prefers curves. You blink, half expecting a cloud to rearrange itself, but the shape holds. A ship, tall-masted, stitched to the wind with sails like pale ribs. The pond, which has been breathing evenly all night, seems to hesitate. Waves from another world slip across the reef, and you feel the way iron, livestock, and germs can tilt a balance without asking politely, the way an unexpected guest changes the temperature of a room just by standing in the doorway. The mainstream historical fact comes into view like that hull. Foreign contact arrives in the late 18th century, with Captain James Cook sighting Hawaii in 1778 and other expeditions following, their anchors biting into unfamiliar bays. Soon there are traders, whalers, missionaries, beachcombers, and driftwood careers washing ashore. Iron tools gleam. Beads and cloth and muskets make the old status systems wobble. And along the coasts, ponds like this one start absorbing changes even without moving a stone. Nets can be cut faster with steel. Gate slats can be shaped more precisely, but the same tides carry new diseases that thin the hands who would use those tools. Historians still argue whether early contact temporarily boosted fish pond efficiency through iron adzes, nails, and imported timber, or whether any gains were drowned by the combined churn of epidemics, shifting labor, and ecological shock. Accounts braid together, a keeper praising a sharper blade, an empty house after a fever season, a gate repaired with proud new iron that no one has the strength to lift next spring. The pond hears both stories and keeps its own counsel, offering what it can to whoever shows up at dawn. Your quirky tidbit walks ashore on cloven hooves. In the 1790s, George Vancouver gifts cattle to Kamehameha I, and a kapu protects the herd. They multiply like a math problem you don't want on a quiz, roaming wild slopes for decades. Hands clap at the bounty, feet wince as fields and trails get chewed up, and rivers carry fresh silt seaward. Goats add their tidy chaos, nibbling everything that thinks about becoming a plant. Down here, where fresh meets salt, ponds taste that new earth. Brown water after storms, a grit that settles in corners the way crumbs claim your keyboard. The makaha still breathes, but sometimes it coughs. From the deck of a ship, sailors stare at this coastline like a tempting pantry. Some befriend, some barter, some behave badly. The tidy categories you like dissolve in salt spray. Traders eye sandalwood in the hills, tugging men inland for the fragrant rush of the early 1800s. Labor that once reset stones is busy hauling logs, and the pond keeps waiting, patient, a calendar pinned to the tides, while the island pins its calendar to market prices. You rub the wall and feel faint scratches that might be chisels and might be stories. Either way, they're sharp. You picture a keeper holding a new iron adze, the weight different from stone, the bite cleaner. He leans over the gate frame, shaving an edge until it sings against wood. He nods. Good tool. He looks up at his cousin's empty hail. Bad season. Two truths stack like stones. Technology slices neatly. History doesn't. If the Menehune were real, you suspect they'd file for overtime and a major raise about now. Good luck with HR. Human rivers, who are spilling silt reports all over the desk. The ships themselves carry curiosities that ripple oddly through pond life. Sailors trade mirrors that catch fish flash like new moons. One log claims locals prized iron nails so highly that hulls earned extra watchmen. Another captain writes about dogs that bark at mullet jumps as if they were cannon reports. You grin, remembering your own startle when a mullet launched like punctuation. The pond, diplomatic as ever, continues to offer commas and semicolons, small leaps, long pauses. You're still following the curve of the wall when the quiet horizon picks up a new geometry. Straight lines where nature prefers curves. You blink, half expecting a cloud to rearrange itself, but the shape holds. A ship, tall-masted, stitched to the wind with sails like pale ribs. The pond, which has been breathing evenly all night, seems to hesitate. Waves from another world slip across the reef, and you feel the way iron, livestock, and germs can tilt a balance without asking politely. The way an unexpected guest changes the temperature of a room just by standing in the doorway. The mainstream historical fact comes into view like that hull. Foreign contact arrives in the late 18th century, with Captain James Cook sighting Hawaii in 1778 and other expeditions following, their anchors biting into unfamiliar bays. Soon there are traders, whalers, missionaries, beachcombers, and driftwood careers washing ashore. Iron tools gleam, beads and cloth and muskets make the old status systems wobble. And along the coasts, ponds like this one start absorbing changes even without moving a stone. Nets can be cut faster with steel. Gate slats can be shaped more precisely. But the same tides carry new diseases that thin the hands who would use those tools. Historians still argue whether early contact temporarily boosted fish pond efficiency through iron adzes, nails, and imported timber, or whether any gains were drowned by the combined churn of epidemics, shifting labor, and ecological shock. Accounts braid together. A keeper praising a sharper blade, an empty house after a fever season, a gate repaired with proud new iron that no one has the strength to lift next spring. The pond hears both stories and keeps its own counsel, offering what it can to whoever shows up at dawn. Your quirky tidbit walks ashore on cloven hooves. In the 1790s, George Vancouver gives cattle to Kamehameha I, and a kapu protects the herd. They multiply like a math problem you don't want on a quiz, roaming wild slopes for decades. Hands clap at the bounty, feet wince as fields and trails get chewed up, and rivers carry fresh silt seaward. Goats add their tidy chaos, nibbling everything that thinks about becoming a plant. Down here, where fresh meets salt, ponds taste that new earth. Brown water after storms, a grit that settles in corners the way crumbs claim your keyboard. The makaha still breathes, but sometimes it coughs. From the deck of a ship, sailors stare at this coastline like a tempting pantry. Some befriend, some barter, some behave badly. The tidy categories you like dissolve in salt spray. Traders eye sandalwood in the hills, tugging men inland for the fragrant rush of the early 1800s. Labor that once reset stones is busy hauling logs, and the pond keeps waiting, patient, a calendar pinned to the tides while the island pins its calendar to market prices. You rub the wall and feel faint scratches that might be chisels and might be stories. Either way, they're sharp. You picture a keeper holding a new iron adze, the weight different from stone, the bite cleaner. He leans over the gate frame, shaving an edge until it sings against wood. He nods. Good tool. He looks up at his cousin's empty hail. Bad season. Two truths stack like stones. Technology slices neatly. History doesn't. If the Menehune were real, you suspect they'd file for overtime and a major raise about now. Good luck with HR, human rivers, who are spilling silt reports all over the desk. The ships themselves carry curiosities that ripple oddly through pond life. Sailors trade mirrors that catch fish flash like new moons. One log claims locals prized iron nails so highly that hulls earned extra watchmen. Another captain writes about dogs that bark at mullet jumps as if they were cannon reports. You grin, remembering your own startle when a mullet launched like punctuation. The pond, diplomatic as ever, continues to offer commas and semicolons, small leaps, long pauses, while humans insist on exclamation points. Missionaries arrive with books and black coats, and you feel time straighten a little. Sabbaths, schools, hymns, sets of rules as deliberate as kapu, but written in different ink. Chiefs navigate the new currents, taking some tools, some teachings, some alliances. In one village, iron nails strengthen a gate. In another, a keeper moves mauka to learn letters. In a third, a cough keeps circling the houses. Nets still unfurl on the good moon nights, but some hands are missing from the rhythm, and silence becomes part of the workday. You try to imagine the pond's version of a patch note. Ocean V2, 0, added ships, changed sediment parameters, nerfed population stability. The joke is soft and a little sad because the real update arrives not in humor but in headcounts. Epidemics, introduced diseases like measles and smallpox, swoop through the 19th century and thin communities. A pond that once relied on a chorus of caretakers now sometimes hums with a trio, then a duet, then a solo. The walls don't collapse. They simply sag at the corners of the year, the way an unwatered garden leans toward memory. Yet even now, you catch stubbornness in the stones. A grandfather teaches a child to read tide notches he carved as a teen. A mother hums a fish calling line while sewing a shirt from new cloth. A young man tests a steel hook, then chooses a net instead, because the calendar says tonight isn't for hooks. The makaha inhales with the rising tide, and tiny fries slip in, unschooled by history and entirely on time. When the moon clears its throat of clouds, the water glitters, and you feel possibility balancing on its toes. You glance back at the mast on the horizon, now a memory, now just a darker stitch in the night. The pond resumes its steady breathing. You match it, long in, long out, letting contact settle where it should, not as a single crash, but as a long, uneven swell. You swipe your palm along the wall to feel the grit of silt, the cool of spray, the faintly oily kiss of limu. Every sensation says adjust. Every splash says continue. Iron, hooves, and germs have all tried to narrate the story, but the fish keep editing. The tide keeps proofreading. And you, the late-night reader, turn the page with a sleepy, careful hand. While humans insist on exclamation points. Missionaries arrive with books and black coats, and you feel time straighten a little. Sabbaths, schools, hymns, sets of rules as deliberate as kapu, but written in different ink. Chiefs navigate the new currents, taking some tools, some teachings, some alliances. In one village, iron nails strengthen a gate. In another, a keeper moves mauka to learn letters. In a third, a cough keeps circling the houses. Nets still unfurl on the good moon nights, but some hands are missing from the rhythm, and silence becomes part of the workday. You try to imagine the pond's version of a patch note. Ocean V2, 0, added ships, changed sediment parameters, nerfed population stability. The joke is soft and a little sad because the real update arrives not in humor but in headcounts. Epidemics, introduced diseases like measles and smallpox, swoop through the 19th century and thin communities. A pond that once relied on a chorus of caretakers now sometimes hums with a trio, then a duet, then a solo. The walls don't collapse. They simply sag at the corners of the year, the way an unwatered garden leans toward memory. Yet even now, you catch stubbornness in the stones. A grandfather teaches a child to read tide notches he carved as a teen. A mother hums a fish calling line while sewing a shirt from new cloth. A young man tests a steel hook, then chooses a net instead because the calendar says tonight isn't for hooks. The makaha inhales with the rising tide, and tiny fry slip in, unschooled by history and entirely on time. When the moon clears its throat of clouds, the water glitters, and you feel possibility balancing on its toes. You glance back at the mast on the horizon, now a memory, now just a darker stitch in the night. The pond resumes its steady breathing. You match it, long in, long out, letting contact settle where it should, not as a single crash, but as a long, uneven swell. You swipe your palm along the wall to feel the grit of silt, the cool of spray, the faintly oily kiss of limu. Every sensation says adjust. Every splash says continue. Iron hooves and germs have all tried to narrate the story, but the fish keep editing, the tide keeps proofreading, and you, the late-night reader, turn the page with a sleepy, careful hand. You leave the memory of sails behind and follow the wall towards shore, where the night thickens around shrubs and survey stakes that aren't supposed to be here yet in your imagination, but arrive anyway, like tidy thoughts crossing a messy room. Straight lines creep into your view again. Where the pond once belonged to tides and stories, you feel something new pressing in: paper, ink, and measurement. The air smells faintly of kukui smoke and damp grass. Somewhere a dog barks at nothing, except, perhaps, the future. The mainstream historical fact settles like a plumb bob. In 1848, the Great Mahele reorganizes land in the Hawaiian Kingdom, slicing an older communal fabric into parcels that can be listed, awarded, taxed, and eventually bought and sold. Crown lands here, government lands there, lands to Alaiai, and, on paper at least, Kuleana plots to Maka'ainana who file claims. Surveyors fan out with chains and compasses. Clerks translate boundaries into metes and bounds. The old Ahupua'a logic still shadows everything, but now it has to fit inside rectangles and descriptions that begin with thence. You feel your footstep cross one of those invisible lines, and it's like stepping from tide pool onto ledger. Historians still argue whether the Mahele is primarily a protective maneuver, an attempt to safeguard Hawaiian control in a world of foreign laws, or the hinge that opens the door to dispossession through taxes, legal fees, and a system most commoners weren't prepared to navigate. They also debate how ponds fit. Were fish ponds property attached to the land award, or distinct resources controlled by chiefs and later private owners? The arguments meander like a spring beneath lava, hidden, persistent, shaping where the water finally appears. You picture a small camp by the pond's edge. A surveyor squints down a sighting stick. An assistant unspools a chain. A Konohiki representative folds arms and points out a mango tree that marks the corner from the time of my grandmother's grandmother. The chain creaks. A gull mocks the geometry. The pond watches polite, while people convert a breathing ecosystem into bearings and degrees. Your quirky tidbit bubbles up. Children from the nearest hale, bored by all this straight-line seriousness, once giggle their way to the field at dusk and nudge a stake a few feet for fun. By morning, the world has shifted by the length of a small prank. Aunties scold, stakes are reset, and the story becomes a family warning about playing with lines that will outlive you. Also, the stake is now guarded by exactly one very stern auntie with a broom. You walk along a new boundary. It cuts across the old footpath to the makaha, then jogs away to avoid a grove of hala. The language of the pond, curves, pulses, seasons, meets the language of law, corners, points, exclusions. Some ponds pass into alii awards. Some are listed under particular chiefs. Others, tangled in documentation, lose clarity. A few families file kuleana claims that include traditional pond access, gathering laimu, a path to the gate, but the precision of the court rarely equals the texture of memory. On a flat rock, a clerk smooths paper and copies testimony. Names accumulate like shells. This person planted taro here, that one tended the gate there. These people shared the harvest on the full moon nights. The clerk dips his pen, writes, pauses, then looks up at you as if to ask whether the mullet jump should be entered into the record. You shrug. The fish chooses that moment to arc, a wet exclamation point. It doesn't make the transcript, but it makes the day. The pond's day-to-day feels the change almost before anyone speaks of it. The head count at harvest shifts. Men who once came because the kapu said so, now come because the paper says they must, or says they must not. A keeper checks the makaha and wonders whether the timber he needs falls inside a parcel he no longer has access to fell. He rubs the gatepost like a worry stone, doing jurisdiction math with calloused thumbs. You catch a quiet truth. Lines can protect and lines can exclude, and sometimes they do both at sunrise, and by sunset you can't tell which was which. A family with a proper award walks the boundary with pride. Another family, late with fees, mutters about selling a corner to pay the tax. The pond keeps breathing, unimpressed by ledgers, but wholly dependent on the people flipping those pages. Your mind drifts to a house where elders explain the new system, tracing squares in the air while a teenager rolls a smooth stone between fingers. Someone jokes that the ahupua'a has not vanished. It has merely learned to write its name in block letters. The joke lands gently, like many jokes tonight, with a smile and a wince. You remember the earlier iron ads? Useful and heavy. The maheli feels like that too. Tools can be blessings or blisters, sometimes both in the same hour. Down by the shore, a notice goes up. Rights to nearby fisheries clarified, certain seasons defined, certain uses permitted only by certain hands. In some districts, konohiki fishing rights are affirmed under the new framework. Another layer of order, another set of potential disputes. In others, confusion trails like a torn net, snagging friendships that have to be carefully mended. You imagine two cousins on either side of a line, arguing softly over who may lift a net on a night the calendar smiles upon. They both step back, embarrassed by the volume of their whisper. You kneel and touch water that doesn't care what parcel number it reflects. Fresh seeps curl into salt just as faithfully as before. Limu combs the stone with the same green patience. Ama cruise by with no passport. Yet harvest day now requires a pocketful of permissions, along with the old chants. You feel a tug in your chest, as if your own ribcage is the new gate, open for some, closed for others, and trying not to splinter under the hinge. Another small laugh arrives, because humans will not stop being humans. A surveyor, sunburned and mosquito-bitten, tries to string a line across the pond and falls in with a curse that splashes history right off his paper. The keeper hauls him out, both of them wheezing. "Bracket your bearings," the keeper says dryly, "between that rock and your pride." The surveyor, dripping, nods and writes it down as if it were a coordinate. Even in this angular moment, care persists. A grandmother takes a child by the hand and walks the same path her mother did, pointing out which shell middens must be left undisturbed, which stretch of wall needs a stone tomorrow, which nights after the ole will bring good water to the gate. She speaks softly, but you hear the older words still living under the new ones. Like a melody that refuses to fade when the harmony changes key. You sit back on the wall and let the ledger lines and tide lines overlap until they blur. The pond was never purely nature nor purely culture. Now it is also paperwork, which is simply culture with a stern face. The moon climbs. Somewhere a clerk trims a quill. Somewhere a keeper checks a knot. Somewhere a cousin decides to forgive a cousin who spoke too sharply about a steak. In the pond, the fish choose not to care, which, if we're honest, is their most enviable quality. The breeze comes cool off the water. You close your eyes and breathe with the makaha again. Inhale, exhale, letting the measured world and the remembered world set against one another like two stones stacked with care. The balance holds. It always has, until it doesn't, and then hands return to reset it. You open your eyes to the gentle sheen of brackish silver, and the lines, for now, lie quietly under the moon. You step off the old boundary path and onto a track that doesn't belong to tides at all. A narrow-gauge line of iron that threads the lowlands like a thought someone forgot to erase. It hums faintly in your imagination, ghost wheels clacking, as if a train might rattle through at any moment, hauling sweetness away from fields that used to feed only the island. The air carries a darker scent now. Damp earth after cutting, a trace of ash from a mill, that caramel whisper of boiled cane that makes your teeth ache just smelling it. The pond is still breathing behind you, but you feel sugar turning its face toward the hills, setting other lungs to work. The mainstream historical fact: by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, sugar plantations spread across the islands, stitching fields with irrigation ditches, flumes, and private railways. Cane needed water, and lots of it, so streams were tapped, diverted, and sometimes rerouted from Mauka to mill. Where those streams once fed springs and seeps that slipped quietly into fish ponds, the flows shifted. Where rain hit bare slopes, new sediment surged. The makaha, the pond's wooden lungs, kept breathing, but more often they wheezed, coughing silt that settled in corners like dust under a bed you promise you'll clean tomorrow. Historians still argue whether plantation hydrology was the single biggest stress on fish ponds, or whether it joined a crowded table, disease-shortened communities, the legal tangles of the maheli, changing diets, overfishing on reefs, and later urbanization. The debate tilts like a half-balanced scale. One scholar points to stream diversions and muddied bays. Another counters with labor loss and ownership shifts. A third folds in storms that rearranged whole shorelines. You listen to them all while the pond, patient as ever, polishes silt into a new bottom and waits for hands to return. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. Old mill yards sometimes kept tubs of molasses for animal feed. And a few keepers swore that on still nights the smell drifted to the coast and made the mullet jump for dessert. Is it science? Probably not. But picture a fish catching a sugar whiff and doing a synchronized leap like it just read the dessert menu. If we're handing out Michelin stars, this pond expects one for caramelized brackish ambiance. You follow a ditch inland, its banks clipped neat by men with machetes and a schedule. The water inside runs fast and purposeful, nothing like the meander of an auwai that feeds loikalo and curves and pauses. Here it is an arrow, leaving a shadow on its own surface, hauling maka coolness to an impatient mill. You crouch and cup some, tasting the faint grit of hillside in your mouth. And you think about what the spring mouths will taste when this finally bleeds back toward the sea. The pond will accept it because it accepts nearly everything, but it will have opinions. Rails cross a low trestle above a marsh where once pua mullet gathered like shimmering commas. Now, after heavy rains, the water turns brown, a latte the size of a small bay curling along shore. In that latte, limu struggles for light, and the stones that used to fuzz green wear a coat the color of stories told too often. You remember the Menehune foreman from earlier and imagine him peering over tiny spectacles, filing a grievance. Excess silt, recommend 10,000 stones moved and 3 chants sung with feeling. HR, Human Rivers, stamps it received, then promptly floods the inbox. Workers in the distance shout and laugh, a rhythm different from the chant lines you've heard in your head tonight, but human all the same. A steam whistle breaks the night, long and lonely, and the pond flinches in your imagination like a bird in sleep. You picture keepers adjusting to a new timekeeper. Moon nights still matter, but so does the 6 a.m. shift. Someone who would have checked the makaha at dawn now checks a boiler first, then the gate at lunch, then sleeps through the tide that used to guide his dreams. You don't judge, you just notice how schedules stack, like nets folded over nets. Along the coast, a keeper tips a bucket and watches water cloud. He frowns. He knows this shade means the algae won't grow right this week. The ama will have to graze harder for the same meal. He scrapes the gate slats, tapping out extra grit, humming a fish calling line under his breath because the tune is muscle memory. He remembers when a neighbor could spare a morning. Now the neighbor rides the cane cars and brings home pay wrapped in paper instead of limu in a basket. Everyone is working. Not everyone is working here. You step where the trestle meets the pond's old path, and the meeting feels awkward, like two cousins who were inseparable as kids and now only see each other at weddings. One speaks in yields and tonnage, in crushing seasons and export prices. The other speaks in crescents of the moon, in spawning pulses and walls that lean only when storms ask rudely. They hug, but their hands don't know quite where to rest. A heron stalks the ditch edge, unbothered by economics, spearing a careless guppy with the focused glare of a librarian shushing a loud tourist. You grin, first joke, and the bird ignores you, which is fair. Down by the makaha, an ama leaps, punctuation to a sentence the plantation ledger never learned to read. You imagine someone at the mill hearing that splash on a still night and smiling without knowing why. On some shores, mills donate timbers or nails for gate repairs, a strange kindness from the very machine that tilted the water's balance. A keeper learns to plane a slat smoother with steel, then spends twice as long clearing the silt that steel's efficiency helped unleash. History loves irony, the way mullet love algae, voraciously. Then a memory from earlier tonight wanders back. The auntie with the broom guarding a survey stake, and you wonder who will stand with a broom against runoff. Maybe the same auntie, standing at the ditch mouth in her rubber slippers, scolding the rain as if it were an unruly nephew. You take your time, Don't all rush the gate. It doesn't change the hydraulics, but it changes her heart, and sometimes that's the hinge that keeps a place from swinging shut. Second joke, dusted lightly with auntie power. You listen for the lunar calendar beneath the steam whistle and find it, softer, but still there. Ola nights continue to be bad nights for pushing your luck. Good moon brings easier netting, even if the water is murkier than it should be. Children still toss crumbs at the edge and giggle at the silver flash, while fathers come home with molasses on their sleeves and a story about a wheel that ran hot. The pond files the stories next to the tides and keeps a little space open for the day when the ditch closes and the stream remembers its older bed. And then, because the night insists on a smile, you picture a runaway cane car bumping gently to a stop at the pond's edge, the crew sprinting breathless to chalk the wheels while a mullet jumps as if to say, "Nice try." third joke. The car is rescued, the pond continues not to be impressed, and the makaha sighs as if laughing very, very quietly. You return to the wall and set your palm on its cool curve. Even with Sugar's insistence, the stones hold their line. Even with brown water, Limu finds a way to green in pockets. The fish do not write angry letters. They make smaller loops, eat slower, wait for clarity. You think about patience as a technology, as effective as iron when wielded by enough hands for enough seasons. The rails will rust someday, the ditch will silt, the mill will go quiet. The pond can outlast them, if memory outlasts them too. The moon eases higher, turning the ditch to pewter and the pond to a soft sheet of tin. You breathe in time with the wooden lungs you met hours ago, in, out, and the taste in the air is complicated. Part sweetness, part mud, part sea. It won't always be like this, you tell yourself. Places learn, people return, stones get reset. But first, the tide keeps its appointment, the way it has honored appointments long before trains learned to whistle. You round a bend where the wall thins and the shoreline rises, and the silhouette waiting there isn't a breadfruit or a challah, but a squat concrete box with slits for eyes. The pillbox sits on the dune like a stubborn toad, its skin flaking, its rusted rebar showing through like whiskers. Farther down, jagged wedges of cement, dragon's teeth, bite into the sand, and you realize you've stepped into a different vocabulary, one of bunkers, barbed wire, and hurry. The pond, which has spent centuries solving problems in slow circles, suddenly has to share the beach with rectangles that speak in orders. The mainstream historical fact is not subtle. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Hawaii is thrown under martial law, coastlines bristle with defenses, harbors are dredged deeper, channels are blasted through reef to speedboats out and back. Airfields and roads spread across lowlands that once held lo'i, marsh, and fish ponds. Blackout curtains go up. Curfews come down. The islands become a forward base that barely sleeps. Where the tide once set the schedule, sirens and convoy horns try to take a turn. Historians still argue whether wartime construction dealt the decisive blow to many fish ponds or whether the larger losses came later, during peacetime development that paved, filled, and parceled what the war had merely shaken. Some point to dredge and fill projects that straightened shorelines and buried makaha under culverts. Others trace the real unraveling to post-war subdivisions and highways that sealed springs and cut access. The pond listens, unamused by both arguments, because it felt the concussion first and the asphalt later. Your quirky tidbit arrives wearing a steel helmet. Soldiers posted along certain beaches, bored between drills, supposedly nicknamed one well-known makaha the toaster, because warm outflow on a cool night felt like a hand warmer when you leaned your palms to it. They didn't know the gate was the pond's wooden lungs. They only knew it kept their fingers limber enough to button a uniform at 0400. Also, somewhere a crab learned to live inside a spent shell casing and scuttle around like a heavily armed hermit. Nature's least intimidating tank. You step past the pillbox and put your ear to the stone. In your mind, you can still hear how it must have sounded then. Shovels, trucks, shouted cadence, the mechanical throat clearing of dredges chewing channels. Blast powder thumps through the reef, and the vibration carries up the wall, into hands that once knew only the push and settle of stones. The pond inhales on a high tide and tastes silt it didn't order. Limu graze for a while like hare shocked by bad news. Ama keep leaping because punctuation is their calling, but their commas look more like ellipses tonight. A keeper walks the wall under blackout rules, no torch, eyes adjusting to starlight. The moon is a contraband flashlight if clouds uncover it. And yet, ironically, the stars are the best they've been in years. He uses the Milky Way like a road he can't drive on, checks the gate by feel, and judges the tide by the cool on his calves. Military time says 2300. Lunar time says, maybe wait 2 more breaths. He listens to both, because that is how you survive, and also how you keep fish for breakfast. First light joke. When an officer barks, "What time is it?" The keeper thinks, "All night," but says, 2300, sir. 2 calendars, 1 answer. On a headland, searchlights sweep the reef. Brief, blinding, then click off again to keep the blackout honest. Mullet flit in the afterimage like startled punctuation marks. Someone on guard throws a piece of hardtack into the shallows and swears a flagtail thanked him. Someone else tosses a spam crust and claims it's the best bait on earth. You picture a mullet reading the label and declining politely for dietary reasons. Second light joke. The fish are pescatarian. They prefer algae. Downshore, a channel through the reef cuts straighter than any tide ever asked for. Boats slide where only canoes once dared, and the sand shifts, starving some beaches and feeding others. The pond's makaha, tuned to a gentler push-pull, feels the new mathematics and starts solving with smaller numbers. Rocks get reset more often. Gate slats swell and jam. Someone with a uniform suggests replacing the whole assembly with a culvert for efficiency. The keeper nods because nodding is efficient too, then waits until the uniform leaves and shaves the swollen edge with a pocket knife, coaxing the wooden lung to breathe again. Inland, a line of tents goes up on ground that used to flood softly during king tides. The soldiers dig shallow trenches and curse the squelch. Locals nod. Yes, that's what wetlands do when you ask them to be parade grounds. The pond takes their runoff, sifts it, and moves on. A Monotone foreman in your mind files another complaint with HR, Human Rivers. Excess hurry, recommend patience deployment. And the stamp comes down. Denied, war. There's a layer of quiet loss that doesn't make headlines or plaques. A grandmother who knows the chant for easing a frightened child past a moa stone has to move mauka when the shoreline becomes a restricted zone. She passes the chant along in a kitchen instead of on the wall, and it loses a pinch of salt somewhere in the translation. A boy who used to learn lunar names from the glint on water learns them from a calendar tacked behind the door of a Quonset hut, which works, but tastes of paper. A makaha whose gate once creaked like a voice grows silent under a concrete pipe. The fish keep arriving as fry because the tide still opens the door, but fewer hands are there to say, welcome, eat, grow. Historians still argue whether accounts of bombs shaking fish dead in distant ponds are exaggerated. Some swear a wave of stunned bodies washed into nets. Others insist fish shock requires proximity, and that rumor outran physics. You don't adjudicate at midnight. You only notice how even rumors add weight to the wall, like extra backpacks slung on a long walk. Yet resilience, that old stone tool, doesn't stay home. In some districts, keepers receive rations of lumber for coastal maintenance and quietly use it to fix a gate. A soldier learns to say ama ama properly and brings back coffee in exchange for a lesson on when not to net. A teacher keeps attendance by moon phase for students who must rotate through fieldwork and guard shifts. And because humor is also a tool, someone paints goofy eyebrows on a pillbox to make it look less like the end of the world. Third light joke. The bunker still can't smile, but it tries. You pause at a blasted cut where water runs quicker than it should. The current tugs your ankle as if testing whether you'll join the inventory of things carried away by necessity. You hold your ground and think of earlier nights. The auntie with the broom guarding a survey stake. The Monotone foreman with his clipboard. The HR department made of rivers. The mullet who insist on editorial leaps. They are all still here, even when steel and powder try to revise the script. The pillbox behind you cools, the concrete releasing heat like a tired lung. You lay a palm on it and then on the quappa, and the difference is as plain as night and day. One built for stop, one built for flow. You imagine the two of them negotiating. The bunker promises to watch, the wall promises to hold. Neither is perfect, both are necessary for a time. And the pond, practical as ever, accepts the partnership with a small shrug and a long memory. When the all-clear siren finally bleeds into quiet, you realize the loudest part of the war, here, might have been the pace itself, the speed of machines, of decisions, of maps redrawn in an afternoon. The pond's losses are not always explosions. They are frictions, culverts where gates fit better, dredge where curves once slowed water kindly, a road that turns a footpath into a detour. Quiet losses, yes, but not invisible if you keep walking, keep touching stone. The tide turns. Somewhere in the dark curve of the makaha, tiny fries shoulder their way through spaces measured with a carpenter's patience. The pond inhales again. You match it, slow and stubborn, and the night resumes its older cadence, layered now with concrete, but still somehow speaking Limu and Moon. By the time you circle back toward the inland end of the pond, the night feels older, and the wall shows it. Stones listing a little, gate timbers weathered to the color of drift tea. You can almost hear a hinge sigh the way a grandparent does when they stand up from a low chair. Rust freckles an old nail in the gate frame. A strip of fencing leans into grass like a tired sentinel that forgot what it was guarding. Decades have passed in your mind's drift. Wars quiet, mills slow, and a different silence settles in. The hush of neglect, the tinny echo of wind rattling corrugated scraps that once promised progress and now only promise tetanus if you're careless. The pond doesn't collapse. It just goes into what your phone would call low power mode, dimming to hold its shape. The mainstream historical fact rises as gently as dawn. In the late 1960s and 1970s, a cultural reawakening gathers in Hawaii. People call it the Hawaiian Renaissance, reviving language, chant, hula, canoe voyaging, and with them old relationships to land and sea. Fish ponds that survived every earlier argument, mahele lines, plantation ditches, bunkers with eyebrows, suddenly show up in songs, in classrooms, in community plans. A few become the focus of deliberate care. Stones reset, weeds pulled, mo'o stories spoken aloud where the water can hear. You feel the shift in your bones, the way a place leans forward when someone finally says its name with respect again. But first, there is the long middle. Years when maintenance means a single uncle walking at dusk with a bucket, clearing what he can reach. He knows every wobble in the wall, every hollow rung in the gate, every rock that will bark his shin if he forgets. His hands remember the calendar, even if his neighbors barely do. He lifts a slat and listens. The wooden lung wheezes, then catches a breath. He nods and mutters something the mo'o understands. A mullet answers with a modest jump, always the editor, adding punctuation to a page that refuses to close. Quirky tidbit drifts down the breeze. An auntie swears she kept kids from sneaking midnight dips by hanging a transistor radio on a nail near the makaha and tuning it to a staticky AM sermon. Even the mo'o no like argue with that voice, she says, and you picture a water spirit choosing a different channel, rolling its eyes, slipping back to the deep end until the benediction ends. Another uncle, not to be outdone, tells you he named a favorite Ama Ama Kalani and said goodnight to it for 3 summers. Did Kalani understand? The uncle shrugs. He got fat, which is a triumph in any language. First light joke. You suspect the fish stayed for the conversation. Free room and board was just a bonus. Historians still argue whether the decline you're stepping through is best explained by hydrology, law, labor, or the giant catch-all of modernity. Was it the rerouted streams, the land titles, the factories and roads, or the soft unraveling of daily habits? And another debate threads the new optimism. Whether the restorations that start appearing in the late 20th century represent continuous tradition carried by quiet hands, or the careful reconstruction of practices remembered in pieces and stitched with modern thread. They argue kindly most days, sharply on others. The pond, which has always liked plural answers, offers both tides at once. Here the path narrows by a storm drain that empties from a neighborhood. On rain days it gushes brown. On dry nights like this, it just murmurs with the faint smell of lawn. You imagine a shopping cart rusting in the cattails, a suburban artifact marooned in wetland, and you try not to take it personally. The auntie with a broom from earlier in the night would have words with whoever pushed that cart. She might also fill it with rocks and wheel it over to the sagging bit of wall because ingenuity is an auntie's birthright. Second light joke. Tell her it's upcycling and she'll tell you it's Tuesday. Then, voices. Not loud, not rowdy, patient and a little breathless. You turn and see a small gaggle of students, flashlights hooded, shoes muddy, following an elder who walks like a metronome. She pauses at the makaha, points to the worn groove where rope used to rub, and sings 2 lines in a voice just above the hush of water. The kids murmur the words back, stumbling, then getting them, then smiling because the syllables sit well in the mouth. She taps the gatepost, tells a story about her tutu feeding scraps to Pua mullet, demonstrates how to tell limukohu from limu, that's just pretending to be fancy. A boy reaches into the water and yelps when a puhi, a small eel, flicks by. No harm done, just a lesson in watch where you put your curiosity. The elder laughs. The eel swims on, and you file the sound with the other good noises of night. Somewhere else on the island, a canoe is being built again with adzes that remember the curve of a blade. Stone, steel, both. A halau practices only that taste of salt. A teacher brings a class to a pond and assigns homework you cannot do on a screen. Listen for 10 minutes, then write down everything you heard. The first paper says nothing. The next week, the papers fill with words like lap, gulp, tick, wing, plop, and a quiet, proud breath. A curriculum blooms that doesn't need a highlighter. You sit with an uncle on a fallen trunk, and he tells you about the first time he saw a backhoe parked where his great-grandmother used to rinse nets. He thought the world was ending. Then years later, he saw a different machine, gentle on its treads, lifting boulders back into the wall under the direction of someone with gray hair, and a clipboard who kept pausing to ask the tide what it preferred. That, he says, looked like the world remembering. He snorts and adds, also, they brought malasadas for the volunteers, so the remembering was delicious. Third light joke, sugared and true. Not every return arrives with a parade. Some are an elder calling a fish by its proper name, while the younger ones nod, trying the vowels on their tongues. Some are a mother scolding a kid for pitching a bottle cap into sacred water, and then telling the story of the mo'o who would have taken a dim view. Some are a teenager learning to splice net cord from a grandpa who can do it without looking, the line between their hands a tether that outlives both. You reach down and touch the water, and it feels slightly warmer, as if the pond registers the attention and blushes. Limu combs the stones in tentative green. A small cloud of pua brightens the edge. The gate's wooden lung, oiled with elbow and memory, draws a cleaner breath than it did an hour ago in your wandering mind. You think of the Menehune foreman with his clipboard filing a new work order with HR, Human Rivers. Condition improving. Recommend continued stories and sandwiches. Approved. Stamped by moonlight. The students linger at the wall, reluctant to leave. The elder dismisses them with a wave, reminding them to say mahalo to the place out loud so the words don't get shy. You hear 20 soft thank yous skim the surface like pebbles, each ringing quietly as it sinks. The pond does not answer in English or Hawaiian, but in a small, satisfied ripple that kisses the stones and repeats itself down the curve like applause in a tiny theater. You stand, stretch, and feel a knot in your back loosen the way a gate hinge loosens when someone finally oils it. This is not the big restoration with clipboards and transects that waits for your next bend in the wall, but it is the Renaissance that makes the restoration inevitable. Songs returning to throats, names returning to minds, hands returning to stones. The fish do their old job of eating and leaping and pretending to be punctuation. The tide keeps its old job of arriving and leaving on time. Your job for tonight is to walk softly, listen well, and carry the story forward like a lantern that doesn't scorch, only warms. You arrive at first light for Alahana, a workday that begins with yawns, coffee in chipped mugs, and the soft clatter of wheelbarrows that have seen more moons than some of the volunteers. The pond greets you with a skin of pewter and a breath held at low tide. Someone in a faded shirt draws a circle in the sand and everyone steps in. A short ollie settles over the group like a warm shawl. You feel the vowels vibrate in your chest, then fall apart into practical instructions. Gloves, water, mind your back, mind each other. A clipboard appears, the modern counterpart to a chant, its grid lines shining in the growing sun. The auntie with the broom is here too, except today it's a rake. The job description is the same. Nudge the world toward better manners. The mainstream historical fact slides into place as plainly as a base boulder. Across the islands, community groups and schools have spent recent decades restoring fish ponds, clearing invasive mangrove and kiawe from the walls, resetting kuapa stones by hand, repairing makaha slats, and monitoring water quality with tools that blink and beep. Lahana workdays are common now. Kids, kupuna, and office folks who forgot they own knees pass stones hand to hand. Where red mangrove once choked gates and smothered flow, a species introduced in the 1900s and very enthusiastic about real estate, saws and patience reopen the throats so the pond's wooden lungs can breathe again. You step into the human chain. A stone presses its cool weight into your palms, and you pass it forward until the next set of hands nestles it into a gap. Big boulders go low, smaller ones chink the spaces, and you leave careful holes where water asks politely to pass. The curve returns, shy at first, then confident, the way a smile rebuilds on a tired face. The Menehune foreman with the clipboard in your head checks a box labeled Flow, then files a memo with HR, Human Rivers. Status, improving. Recommend persistence and snacks. Approved, stamped, and notarized by Tide. First joke, stamped in brackish ink. between stone trains, a volunteer hands you a refractometer with the ceremony of a master passing a treasure. "One drop," she says. You tilt the prism, blue line, number, scribble, salinity. Someone wades off with a dissolved oxygen meter. Someone else lowers a Secchi disc and reads the vanishing point of white. The spreadsheet on the folding table has more tabs than a malasada counter has flavors, and you cannot resist the whisper that chance and cells are both ways of remembering. A kid writes the moon phase in the margin, because the old calendar still insists on having an opinion, and the spreadsheet, to its credit, accepts the note. Historians still argue whether today's restorations represent an unbroken continuity of practice or a careful reinvention stitched from oral histories, archaeology, and trial and error. How much is memory maintained in quiet families, and how much is recovery guided by teachers and archives? They also differ on whether numbers, salinity, turbidity, temperature truly map onto the older sensibilities of taste, smell, and fingertip feel. You stand in the overlap, one hand on stone, the other on a pen, and decide it's a good argument to keep having, preferably with snacks. A quirky tidbit wades by. One pond crew famously named their most reliable wheelbarrow Ama Ama Express, complete with a hand-painted fish on the tray. It squeaks like a night heron and carries twice its weight if you promise it a rinse at the end of the day. Another site ties a lei of tie leaves onto the first stone reset each morning. A tiny ceremony that makes the rock seem to sit up straighter. Whether the mo'o notices is unknown, but you feel noticed, which is nearly the same thing in this kind of work. You trade the refractometer for loppers and follow a line of mangrove stumps that look like a field of old knuckles. Cut too high, and the tree returns with spite. Cut low, and it takes the hint and retires. Your shoes collect burrs. Your hair collects stories. Your water bottle collects admiration for being exactly where you left it. Down the wall, someone pries barnacles from a gate slat with the patience of a librarian rescuing a book from tape. The makaha's wooden lungs wheeze less with each scrape, and when a small surge finally slips cleanly through the slats, the group sighs in chorus. Data hour returns. Vials line up like little priests. You label them with date, time, and a doodled moon because science is allowed to smile. A volunteer leans over your shoulder and says, "If the salinity drops after rain but the oxygen holds, we're fine." You nod like you knew that, and maybe you did. Your fingertips tasted something similar earlier when you trailed them in the pond and the water felt soft as steeped tea. Second joke? Self-deprecating. You decide your degree today is in hand-feel engineering. A conch sounds from the far curve. Break time. People plop onto stones, unwrap musubi, and pull oranges from a cooler that swears it has kept things cold since before sunrise. Stories bloom with the fruit. Someone remembers their tutu carrying ope in a woven basket. Someone else says the first time they measured temperature here, it was too hot for mullet and too hot for me. A teacher points out a cloud bank and calls it incoming data. The auntie with the rake pretends not to smile and then absolutely smiles. Back to it. You help plant a line of native sedges along a muddy edge where the bank needs an anchor that knows how to drink flood and not slide away. Their roots will knit the margin, filtering whatever the street sends after a hard rain. A teenager reads the plant names like spells, rolling syllables carefully, and you feel the pond listening, filing each new root and each new voice into its slow ledger. Near the gate, a kid whispers an apology to the mo'o stone and drops 3 kuki nuts beside it. Whether this is sanctioned protocol or imaginative diplomacy is unclear, but it's hard to argue with considerate behavior. A minute later, a mullet jumps, which everyone takes as approval because punctuation is generous. Third joke, the fish is basically giving a thumbs up, if fish had thumbs and less commitment to commas. On the spreadsheet, numbers begin to paint a day, salinity in the mid-morning sweet spot, temperature climbing but shy of grouchy, clarity improving after the mangrove cuts. Someone photographs the wall from 3 angles, so that weeks from now the curve can be measured by pixels as well as by pride. Another volunteer sketches the same section in a notebook, the lines wavery but full of affection. 2 technologies, 1 intent. You carry 1 last stone, awkward and perfect for the gap you've been eyeing all morning. Hands guide it down. It settles with the quietest kiss on its neighbors. The curve no longer looks tired. It looks like itself. The tide swells, slips through the newly cleared throat of the makaha, and exhales on the inside of the pond with a sound so small you almost miss it. You don't. You've been practicing listening. Before the group breaks, the leader calls everyone back to the circle. Thanks are given out loud, to the volunteers, to the ancestors, to the fish who stubbornly showed up even when the gate coughed. The leader adds thanks to the data for telling its story honestly, and to the chance for insisting the story is bigger than numbers. You murmur your own mahalo to the stones under your feet. The Menehune foreman checks his watch, nods, and writes POW on the invisible form. HR, Human Rivers, stamps it with a ripple. As you shoulder the wheelbarrow, Ama Ama Express squeaking officiously. The afternoon light lays itself flat on the pond, and everything looks slower, solvable. You know there are more days like this ahead. More mangrove roots, more salinity lines, more sandwiches by the wall. But the pond's breath is steadier tonight. You can hear it, inhale, exhale, and your own chest moves in time, carrying a quiet thought you won't need to write down. Keep coming back. Morning folds into afternoon, and you keep walking the wall with the easy patience of someone who has learned the pond's breathing. The stones feel solid underfoot, yet you can sense how the line between solid and soft is shifting, how water is negotiating for more room with each stubborn season. You pause where the quappa dips lowest and imagine a future king tide sliding over like an uninvited guest who swears they texted first. The pond will not panic, ponds don't. But you can tell it's thinking about adjustments. Higher stones, wider throats, new paths for old flows. The mainstream historical fact is a quiet one dressed in paperwork. In the last decade, agencies and communities in Hawaii have built partnerships to restore and manage loko IA together. Streamlined permits here, co-management agreements there, statewide networks sharing methods like recipes. Scientists bring meters and models. Kia'i loko bring memory and timing. School kids bring knees that still like kneeling. It isn't a return to a sealed past. It's a living present, translated across clipboards and chants. You crouch and let brackish water slide over your fingers. It's a little warmer than you expect, and you hear people mutter about sea level rise the way farmers talk about early frosts. Matter of fact, not melodramatic. The wall behind you won't stop the ocean forever. It never did. It slowed, sifted, persuaded. Maybe that is the job going forward. Not fortress, but flow manager. Not holding the line, but moving the line kindly. The auntie with the broom appears in your mind, planting her feet at the edge of a puddle and sweeping it into a better shape. First light joke. Climate change is basically a very rude guest. The auntie is ready with a dustpan and a list of boundaries. Historians still argue whether ancient keepers routinely rebuilt walls inland and out again as sandbars shifted, or whether many ponds clung to their first footprints for centuries with only modest edits. The archaeology offers hints, older stones beneath younger ones, foundations tucked deeper than expected, but even the experts shrug at the exact choreography. What you do know, as you squint across the pond, is that adaptation is not a modern word here. It's the oldest word in the wall. A breeze slips over the water, and you imagine design meetings that begin with Oli and end with CAD drawings, where people sketch living shoreline ideas that blend native sedges, low stone terraces, and makaha tuned for new storm patterns. The wooden lungs may get wider ribbing. The gate may move a few paces to catch a gentler current. Upland, a gulch may be replanted so that rain arrives as pearls instead of fists. A younger volunteer suggests floating log booms to deflect debris on flood days. An elder shakes her head and proposes a small curve added to the wall. The stone already knows the angle. The room hums with the best kind of argument, the one where both sides want the tide to win wisely. Your quirky tidbit paddles in from the tech side. One restoration crew trains a drone to follow the wall and count mullet jumps by shadow. Someone writes an algorithm titled punctuation detection, because of course they do. It works about as well as you'd expect until a night heron photobombs every pass like a feathery supermodel. The crew names the bird Object 1 and buys it a commemorative sticker it does not appreciate. Second light joke, the heron declines to sign a release form, citing creative differences. You kneel by the makaha and think about future gates. Bigger storms push stronger tongues of salt into freshwater plumes. Droughts make springs shy. A keeper in 2080 will likely carry a meter in one pocket and a chant in the other, test salinity, test their own patience, and decide whether to shift slats for an evening's breath. A spreadsheet will catch the numbers. A child's story will catch the feeling. Both will be necessary. You picture the Menahune foreman with his eternal clipboard sighing blissfully as a USB drive dangles from the lanyard next to his stone tally. The wall's stones glitter with spray. You palm one and feel the tiniest tremor, from a truck on the new road, from a boat's wake, from your own heartbeat. If sea level rises by inches, this rock will become a cousin to a reef stone. If storms bite deeper, the curve will need more cousins to hold shape. You remember the wheelbarrow, Ama Express, and decide that the future requires a fleet, one to haul rock, one to ferry sedges, one to distribute malasadas because morale is a structural element, even if engineers don't list it on the plan set. Third light joke. Malasada shear strength should be a unit, and you are prepared to do extensive field testing. You look inland. The Ahupua logic returns with modern grammar. Green infrastructure, floodplain reconnection, managed retreat. The words feel bureaucratic in the mouth, but sensible in the hands. Maybe a stream will get its bends back. Maybe a parking lot will step aside for a wet meadow that catches the first brown rush after rain. Maybe a subdivision will learn to point its gutters toward bioswales that sing softly in stormlight. The pond won't write the policies, but it will grade them gently, with mullet punctuation. Leap for a good idea, long ellipsis for a questionable one. Community meetings, once rare, feel familiar now. Someone spreads topo maps on a folding table. Someone else brings a tray of cut mango and a stack of name tags. The kupuna in the front row asks about access rights. The grad student asks about pH trends. The fisherman asks about nights when a whole gather like gossip. It is a chorus with an agenda, and when a decision comes, it comes in pieces. Raise this stretch of wall by 2 hands height. Leave that dip for seasonal overflow. Plant 3 more rows of aki grass. Repair the far gate slat with that old ohia a cousin promised. The plan is less a blueprint than a garden calendar tilted toward the moon. You let your fingertips drift through the surface again, tasting the faint sweetness of spring water where it rises like a secret. You don't need a model to tell you the pond is a climate tool as much as a dinner plan. Cooler water buffering heat, wet edges storing flood, a nursery that turns small fry into big patience. People talk about resilience on slides. Here, resilience licks your wrist like a friendly dog and wanders off to chase a dragonfly. Historians still argue whether these 21st century efforts are best understood as conservation projects, cultural revivals, or acts of sovereignty that stitch political will back to place. You think of the auntie with the broom, the students with their vials, the uncle who named his fish Kalani, and conclude it's all of them at once. Science, story, and self-determination braiding like tie leaves into a cord too strong to snap. Dusk leans in. On the far curve, someone lights a small lantern and sets it safely on a rock so the last wheelbarrow knows where home is. The light flickers on the makaha slats, and for a second you imagine tomorrow's gate, wider maybe, or slightly higher, or carved with new notches that say, "We learned from last winter's storm." Tiny fry will read those notches with their bodies, slipping through the spaces that builders have measured with love. You stand, slow, and the wall stands with you, a companion rather than a pedestal. The future is not a cliff. It's a set of tide tables with scribbles in the margins, a handful of plans annotated by grandparents, a drone that might behave if the heron allows, a song the kids almost remember until the elder hums the missing notes. You breathe in, and the pond breathes with you. In, out, ready to practice again tomorrow. The Menahune foreman straightens his clipboard, checks adapt, and hands the form to HR, Human Rivers, who stamps it with a soft, unstoppable wave. You stroll the last arc of wall the way you'd walk a familiar street at dusk, nodding to every curve like it's a neighbor who has loaned you sugar more times than you care to admit. The stones remember your footfall by now, and you remember their small lessons. Don't rush where water refuses. Don't force what a curve can solve. Don't talk over a tide that is already speaking. The pond's wooden lungs whisper through the makaha. Inhale, exhale, and you keep time, your steps a metronome set to brackish. On your right, the ocean turns its pages. On your left, the shallows glint with the confetti of fish that insisted on being punctuation all night long. A mainstream historical fact walks quietly beside you. Across the Hawaiian Islands, hundreds of fish pond sites have been documented, concentrated on Oahu and Molokai, scattered on Hawaii Island, Maui, Kauai, and Lanai, together forming one of the largest pre-modern aquaculture traditions in Polynesia. You don't recite the count, you just feel the number in your ribs. As if each sight is a heartbeat you could line up like stars on a clear night and navigate by. The curve you're on is one dot in that constellation, and suddenly the wall seems both specific and shared. This gate, these stones, and a family of cousins you haven't met, breathing in time on other shores. Historians still argue whether the largest kuapa were chiefly prestige projects or primarily food security work that grew with population and coordination. They wrangled dates and radiocarbon bits, pointing at layers of stones like chapters. You lift a hand and pat the wall as if to say, "You're impressive, sure, but you're also dinner." And the wall, modest as always, says nothing back. First light joke. Walls that feed you don't have to clap for themselves. The breeze finds you where the wall leans landward, and the pond shows you a greatest hits reel as the night stretches thin. There's the auntie with the broom, now a rake, now a stern eyebrow at a storm drain. There's the Menahune foreman with his clipboard, eternally filing to HR, human rivers, who stamp every form in progress with a ripple. There's the Ama Ama Express wheelbarrow, squeaking along like a night heron with a secret. There's Kalani, the mullet with the good appetite, doing a polite comma where an exclamation point would be gauche. The pillbox with drawn-on eyebrows sulks photogenically in the distance, pretending it belongs to an era of gentle curves. You grin and add a private head nod for the drone that tried to count fish jumps and got distracted by a supermodel heron. Second light joke. If birds had agents, that one would demand top billing over the tide. You pause where a spring braids its coolness into the pond, and you think of all the agreements you've watched tonight. Kapu that once kept greedy hands from scooping the pantry. Lunar calendars that told fishermen when to lift a net and when to go home with humility. Makaha that breathed with tide instead of fighting it. Survey lines that bit and protected in uneven measures. Plantations that pushed water into unfamiliar math. Bunkers that squared the beach. Families and schools who brought clipboards and chants and malasadas to reset the curve. The pond absorbed every verb you've named. Build, sing, divide, divert, blast, remember, restore, adapt. You whisper mahalo to each word, because they all left fingerprints on the stones beneath your sandals. A quirky tidbit floats up like a leaf. Some keepers swore that if you tapped the gatepost 3 times with a smooth pebble before dawn, the first ama ama would jump within the next tide cycle. Is it science? It's rhythm. You tap the nearest stone anyway, 1, 2, 3, and the pond pretends not to notice until, of course, a silver arc lifts and falls as if to say, "Not for your pebble, just for the cadence." Third light joke. You accept the correction. The fish is the editor-in-chief. You walk on and feel the small tug that means your time here is folding itself away. The wall no longer asks you to learn. It asks you to remember. You oblige in the simplest way, by repeating names under your breath like prayers. Ama ama awa ahole hole. Kuapa, makaha, awawai. Limu, pua, mo'o. You add the ordinary words for the human kit. Bucket, net, wheelbarrow, spreadsheet, song. Together they make a vocabulary you can carry home, without breaking airline rules or the patience of whoever sits next to you on the plane. As you near the shore, you glance back one last time. The curve holds steady in moonlight, a shy smile remade by many hands. You picture future mornings, a child mapping salinity with a refractometer and a grin, an elder kneeling to taste the water and nod, a pair of cousins debating whether this will be a raise the wall 2 hands year or a shift the gate 1 slat year, a drone kept honest by a heron with no time for NDAs. Tomorrow, the pond seems to say, I'll need a little more help. Bring your patience, bring your jokes, bring snacks. You step off the last stone into sand that remembers you. The sea, satisfied with the lesson plan, runs a soft brush along the reef. The pond inhales, the pond exhales, and you mirror it, once, twice, until the pulse becomes your own. You've learned the slow grammar of water tonight, where commas are fish and periods are tides and the paragraph never ends, it only widens. You bow your head, not theatrically, just enough for the mo'o to feel respected, for the Menahune foreman to tick a box, for the auntie to approve with a half smile, and say the one word that fits all currents. Mahalo. Word count. 1051. The wind down begins softly, like a tide unknotting itself from the shore. You sit on the sand and let the last of the night lengthen every breath. The wall is behind your shoulder now, not as a guard but as a gentle hand, and the makaha keeps breathing so quietly you almost forget the sound is there. In the half-light before morning, colors lose their edges. The pond becomes a single sheet of quiet silver. The reef becomes a line of sleep at the horizon. You feel your shoulders drop, your jaw loosen, your thoughts settle the way silt settles when the current grows kind. Nothing here is in a hurry. The stones have centuries to consider their places. The fish have their patient circuits, small and certain. The springs bring coolness without announcement, and the sea brushes it into softness. If worries arrive, the water lifts them the way it lifts petals, out a little way, and then into the larger rhythm where they become smaller, rounder, lighter. You listen to the names you've gathered tonight fade into vowels and then into the quieter language beneath names. The hush of water on stone, the soft, even pull of tide, the nearly inaudible smile of air moving over your skin. When you close your eyes, you can still see the curve of the wall, a crescent that holds without gripping. You borrow that shape for your own breathing. Slow in, slower out, and let it guide your pulse. Each exhale is a thank you to the hands that set the stones. Each inhale gathers back a little freshness from the springs. You are held in a patient architecture, one that asks you for nothing more than to rest the way water rests, spread out, supported, gently persuaded into calm. Morning will come, and the pond will take its appointments. Tide, light, the quiet arrival of Fry through the gate, but for now the calendar is only this. A long, soft pause. A shoreline that doesn't need you to decide anything. A world that moves at the speed of breath. Let the last of the moonlight smooth your thoughts. Let the gate breathe for you. Let the water and the wall and the waiting make a cradle out of the night. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.